My name is Zander Venter, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Cape Town under the supervision of Michael Kramer and Heidi Hawkins. I've been working on an experimental trial set up on Fritz Nell's farm called Merino Walk in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, and we are testing what is known as holistic planned grazing, a grazing management strategy on the farm, and I'd like to present some results from the first 2 years of the experimental trial. This project falls under Conservation South Africa, and I'm at the University of Cape Town. The title of the talk is Holistic Planned Grazing So Far Fails to Beef Up Farm Production, and it's told from an ox's eye view. During this talk you will see cattle grazing from space and even experience a day in the life of an ox. So to start with, I'd like to give you some background on holistic planned grazing. It was developed by an ecologist named Alan Savory, who looked at the way wild herbivores graze, such as you can see in the top picture of wildebeest over the Serengeti, grazing and moving in very dense herds. This was in stark contrast to what is seen on most livestock farms, where cattle graze at lower densities across the landscape. So Alan suggested imitating this on the farm by dividing it up into many camps with using electric fencing, and cattle are rotated amongst these within an adaptive management framework. So that is the background, and I'd like to focus in on one of the key principles that Alan Savory observed, and is best captured in this quote of his: "The behavior of the animals clearly changes at such densities. Their hooves break up capped soils and knock down old plants. Though we cannot say for sure why it does, we do know it is related to the large numbers and the limited grazing space that each animal appears eager to call its own." And Alan referred to this as the herd effect, where animals are in high densities and causing them to have a hoof action on the soil, trampling plant material, dung and urine into the soil surface and breaking the soil crust. Tainton also remarked that the mythical herd effect, which supposedly develops when large numbers of animals are grouped together, remains a contentious issue. And in fact, it remains a contentious issue today, and very few studies have focused on the herd effect as a mechanism behind the claims that holistic management practitioners make. So many studies have focused on production, but very few have focused on the mechanisms. So we set up to test these mechanisms and the general production on a farm called Merino Walk in the Eastern Cape near Cedarville. The farm has been divided into 3 areas under 3 different management regimes. The first is a season-long grazing regime where animals spend an entire season in one camp and are moved to another camp for the other half of the year. This is generally at grazing densities of 0.5 livestock units per hectare. The second is a 4-camp rotation in green, you can see here, where animals are rotated amongst 4 camps at varying levels of intensity between the 4 camps. Then finally, holistic planned grazing, where the area is divided into many grazing strips with electric fencing, upping the livestock units per hectare to 25. And just over this map, I've overlaid the sampling points where we performed vegetation and soil sampling, which I'll refer to later in the talk. Here is a satellite imagery time lapse of the normalized difference vegetation index. This is basically the greenness of the grass over time. And at the black arrow you can see the effect that the grazing strips under holistic planned grazing have on the vegetation. And to show you that this is not just an artifact of something else, these are the GPS points from oxen that were fitted with GPS collars. And you can see that where the GPS points appear, there is a significant decrease in the greenness of the grass, just to show you that these animals, as they graze, are causing this change in the NDVI that you can observe from the satellite. This is a drone image showing the same effect. You can see this grazing strip. There are a group of the holistic oxen in the middle. And on the ground, it is also a stark contrast. On the left, a camp that has been grazed for 24 hours, and they will be moving into the camp on the right. So these grazing effects are obvious, and they can be seen, but it is not so obvious whether the mechanisms are acting as well. And so we set up to test the following claims. First of all, holistic plan grazing claims that through this so-called herd effect, there is an increased time spent grazing, that animals stick closer together so they're at greater proximities to each other in their movement, and there's increased trampling of the soil, vegetation and dung through increased number of steps animals take. Secondly, then, this is proposed to influence the utilization of the forage, increase the amount and the homogeneity of the forage they utilize, and decrease the selectivity. This is basically the selection for palatable plants and the overgrazing of these plant species at both the plant and the patch scale. Thirdly, this is proposed to increase vegetation production. In the short term, through increased water and nutrient cycling through trampling, as the animals trample dung and urine into the soil, it increases nutrient cycling and breaks the soil crust, allowing water to infiltrate. And over the long term, through reducing selectivity of palatable species, there is a favorable species composition which increases vegetation production. And finally, this is proposed to increase cattle production. And the literature on vegetation and cattle production, there have been quite a few studies done, and basically there's been one author, T et al., that has focused on holistic plan grazing and has found an increase in vegetation and cattle production, but there have been many other authors who have found a neutral or decreased effect of holistic plan grazing on vegetation and cattle production. However, there have been very little to no research on the behavioral mechanisms, behavior, movement, trampling, defined as the herd effect, and how this influences the selectivity and the utilization of the vegetation. So it was with this in mind that we aimed to test the following hypotheses. First, that there is an increased time spent grazing at greater proximities to one another under holistic plan grazing. Secondly, that the animals take more steps and consequently trample more dung. Thirdly, that there's an increased utilization of the standing biomass available. And fourthly, that holistic plan grazing decreases the animal's ability to select for palatable plants at both the plant and the patch scales. So to test these hypotheses, we did behavioral observations, observing when the cattle were grazing, walking, resting, and at what distances they were to each other. We also employed the use of GPS trackers on GPS collars, where we monitored where they move and how they move over the landscape. And thirdly, we employed the use of triaxial accelerometers. Now these are what you find in fitness monitors or pedometers, and basically they measure acceleration along the X, Y, and Z axis, and we can use these to model or predict different behavioral states, such as grazing, resting, and walking. So to test the first hypothesis, that there's increased time spent grazing at greater proximities, we used triaxial accelerometers. We deployed 10 of these activity monitors for 3 weeks at a time. They make a recording every 0.5 seconds, and this equates to over 35 million data points that we had to analyze. And through using a variable called magnitude, which is really a composite of the acceleration along the three axes, along with other variables, feeding them into a random forest model, we will be able to predict behaviors, grazing, resting, and walking with 94% accuracy over the entire time. So this is an example of a day in the life of an ox. This graph shows the magnitude of acceleration on the y-axis, and it is a 24-hour period on the x-axis from 6 in the morning to 6 in the morning the next day. And you can see that in the morning there's a lot of grazing, then over lunch a mixture of grazing, resting and walking, then in the evening again a lot of grazing, and surprisingly a lot of grazing but around 10 p.m. in the evening, and surprisingly 3 to 4 a.m. in the morning. So cattle are actually active through the night grazing, with rest periods of around 3 to 4 hours in between. So then what we did was take this data for each animal and work out a percentage time spent grazing, resting, walking, and then we used that to perform a statistical analysis, comparing the three different treatments: season-long, for-camp, and holistic grazing. And basically we found no difference in the time spent grazing, resting, or walking between the three treatments. Then, through our behavioral observations, we were able to ascertain at what distance the animals were to each other when they were grazing, and we found that in fact holistic planned grazing animals grazed at greater distances to each other than season-long grazing. This is counter to the hypothesis we had, where we thought they would graze in tighter herds and therefore be at closer distances to each other. Then, to test the second hypothesis, that there's an increased number of steps taken and there's increased dung that is trampled, we also used the activity monitors and calculated a step rate, steps per minute for each of the oxen. And we also used statistical analysis to compare the three grazing treatments, and an analysis of variance shows that there was no difference in the number of steps taken. Just to point out for those of you who are not sure of statistical analysis, these are called standard error bars, and when one standard error bar overlaps with another standard error bar, it shows that these two treatments are not statistically different to one another. So these letters here indicate that there's no difference between the treatments. Apologies for the messy drawing. Then, to measure the percentage of dung that was trampled, we at each of the vegetation sampling points we counted the number of trampled dung pats, and we've also found that there was no difference in the number of dung pats that were trampled across the treatments. To test the third hypothesis, that there was increased utilization of standing biomass, we used a descending point method, a device called a Levi bridge, where we sampled 10 points at each of our vegetation sampling locations, and we measured the percentage of plants that were intercepted that were actually grazed, and we found that there was again no difference in the utilization of available forage for holistic planned grazing relative to the other treatments. So they did not use more of the grass that was available, as the hypothesis predicted. Then, to test the fourth hypothesis, that holistic planned grazing decreases the selectivity for palatable plant species, we also use the descending point method, and here's a graph of the proportion of plant species grazed. So on the x-axis you can see a list of plant species, and on the y-axis you can see the proportion of these plant species that were grazed. And For example, here is a Phemida triandra, which is a rooigras, a highly palatable plant, and you can see that it was grazed, in fact, across the 3 treatments, the season-long 4-camp and holistic grazing. Then here is Eragrostis chloromelis and Eragrostis plana. These are classified as 2 increaser 2 species in that they are unpalatable and they increase under grazing pressure. But these, in fact, were also grazed almost as much as the Phemida triandra. And then, so if to ascertain selectivity index, basically we're asking what proportion of the available plant species did the animals select for. So what proportion did they graze? And this is a very rudimentary measure, but basically the proportion of the plants that were selected for under holistic planned grazing was 0.57. So they in fact selected for less of the plants, less of the available plants. So holistic planned grazing did not reduce the selection. If it did reduce the selection, we'd expect them to have grazed all of the available plants evenly, but in fact they selected for specific plant species. Then to test whether there's also a decreased selectivity at the patch scale, so in other words, over the entire camp, do they graze at over specific patches? So for this we used the GPS trackers. We deployed 20 trackers for 2 months at a time in the winter 2016, summer and winter 2017. They make a recording every 5 minutes, and with this we have around 1 million data points that we had to analyze. And the accuracy of these GPS trackers are around 5 to 10 meters. So to assess how selective the oxen were at the landscape scale, we used what is known as the Clark-Evans aggregation index. This is basically how clumped or randomly evenly scattered the GPS points are over space. So the index is called R, and when R is less than 1, they are clumped, and when R is greater than 1, the points are scattered evenly over the landscape or randomly over the landscape. So here is an example from the summer of January 2017, and these are the camps that the cattle occupied under season-long 4-camp and holistic grazing. And then here is a heat map of the GPS points, and you can see the R values below the Clark-Evans index. And you can see, for example, that holistic planned grazing has an R of 0.395, which is closer to 0, meaning that the points were more clumped relative to the other 2 treatments. But we used repeated measures ANOVA to test whether this was statistically significant, and we found that there was no difference in the grazing heterogeneity. So basically, there was no difference between the 3 grazing treatments in the way they selected for patches over the camp, which was again counter to the hypothesis that holistic planned grazing would cause a homogeneous grazing over the camp. So to conclude, first of all, we found that there was no effect of holistic planned grazing on the time the animals spend grazing, and in fact they graze at looser densities relative to the season-long grazing treatment. Secondly, we found that there was no difference in the number of steps the animals take, and no difference in the number of dung pats that they trample. Thirdly, there was no effect on the utilization of the available standing biomass. And fourthly, there was no effect on the selectivity for palatable plants or palatable patches over the entire camp. So to conclude, overall, the take-home message is that there was no evidence for the so-called herd effect as a mechanism behind holistic planned grazing. Although I have not shown the results here, vegetation and cattle production, we have been measuring that, and they have also largely been unaffected by holistic plan grazing. However, it is still early days. The trial has only been going for 2 years, and we may see that changes in basal cover, for example, increased plant litter and plant basal width, may have long-term consequences for species composition. So these effects may only emerge after many years. Then there's also the question about ultra-high density grazing. We only tested densities at about 25 LSUs per hectare, but some ultra-high density farmers graze at about 1,000 LSUs per hectare. So perhaps this so-called herd effect will emerge at ultra-high densities. We also have not tested this on sheep or goats, obviously, and they might behave differently and respond to holistic management differently. But overall, the advocacy for high-density grazing approaches with specifically cattle in the Eastern Cape grasslands is questionable based on the evidence that we have found on our experimental farm. So that is the talk that I gave at the Grassland Society conference in Hoedspruit. And if you'd like to listen further, I'm just going to touch on the animal and vegetation productivity aspects, which were not included in the talk, but may be of interest to specifically Fritz, the farmer, and others who are listening. So this is just a slide showing the vegetation production. On the left, it's a graph showing the standing biomass measured with a disc pasture meter, and this is a change in the standing biomass in kilograms per hectare since the baseline. So since December 2015, has there been an increase or a decrease in the biomass? And here you can see that there's in fact no difference between holistic plan grazing and the other two treatments in the change in standing biomass. So although Fritz the farmer, Gerbrand, Nel and myself noted that the holistic animals were seemed to be leaving a lot of biomass behind, when this, based on the statistics, when we compare it to the baseline, there's in fact no difference in between holistic and the other treatments. Then the graph on the right shows basal cover, which is divided into bare soil, litter, and plant. And here we can also see on the y-axis is a change in proportional ground cover. So what percentage of the ground was bare soil, litter, or plant? And basically the only differences here are that holistic plan grazing saw an increase in plant litter, whereas season-long grazing saw a decrease, and holistic plan grazing saw an increase in plant cover relative to the 4-camp system. So this just shows that holistic plan grazing is contributing to an increase in plant litter, which has been shown by many other studies, and potentially basal cover as well. And these may have longer-term consequences, which we aren't seeing at the moment. Then this is showing the animal production. The graph at the top here is the animal weight gain, the average daily gain in kilograms per day. And this are divided into summer and into winter. And you can see that for winter there is no difference between the 3 grazing management systems. However, in summer, holistic animals have a lower average daily gain than the season-long grazing animals. And this graph on the bottom here shows the animal weight through time, and you can see here that in summer, between January and about May, the season-long grazing animals have a higher weight relative to the other 2 treatments. Then this is just cattle production across breeds, And this graph shows the continuous or season-long, for-camp and holistic grazing management treatments. And on the right here you've got the new oxen and the old oxen. These were a set of 10 oxen that we used for weighing, and overall, based on the statistical test called an ANOVA, analysis of deviance, there was no difference, no significant difference between the breeds, the animal breeds, Bonsmara, Boran, Simmenthaler and Thule. No difference in the weight gain across these breeds. Then this is just a graph showing behavioral observations. So the data I showed above was from the accelerometers, the activity monitors, which we've only deployed once in winter about a few weeks ago. But so it basically only incorporates, it only shows a winter sampling. But here we did behavioral observations, namely scan and focal samples, in both summer and winter. And interestingly, in summer we see that the holistic animals spend less time grazing than the other two grazing management systems. So and in winter there's no difference, as we saw with the activity monitors. So maybe next year, January, when we deploy the activity monitors, we'll also see that holistic animals spend less time grazing. For resting there's no big difference, and for walking there's no big difference in the time they spend on these activities. Then this is just another graph showing this two different types of sampling, scan sampling and focal sampling. Scan sampling is where we looked up and we notified what each individual in the herd was doing at that time. Focal sampling was where we followed one individual for a period of 2 minutes at a time and notified what they were doing when. And basically this shows the same result, that holistic planned grazing had spent less time grazing relative to the other two treatments. Then we also counted the number of steps the animals took, visually counting them, and we found again the same as the activity monitors, that there was no difference between the grazing management treatment. Then this is just a bit of technical detail on the activity monitors, or the triaxial accelerometers. It's quite difficult to explain, but basically we took the measurements of the acceleration in the X, Y and Z direction, and we used a whole combination of mathematical formulas to create different variables that use these three accelerations. So when an animal is grazing, if their head is moving back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, it gives a specific signal along the X, Y and Z axis. When they're walking, it's more of there's a bit of a side-to-side motion and a nodding up and down, slower than grazing. That gives a different signal. And when they're resting, obviously when they're standing still, there's very little change in the X, Y and Z axis. So basically we tried to capture that mathematically, and then what you do is you feed those different mathematical formulas into what is called a random forest model. And what that does is it's known as a machine learning algorithm, where it takes a training data set. So basically what we did was we observed the cattle with the activity monitors on, and we noted, okay, at 10 o'clock in the morning they're grazing, at 11 o'clock in the morning they were resting, and then we tell the model that they were doing those behaviors at those times, and then the model looks at the X, Y and Z axis data, and it tries to learn what combination of X, Y, and Z accelerations equate to a specific behavioral category. So this variable importance plot on the left here basically shows which variables, mathematical variables, were the most important in predicting the behavioral categories. And here you can see right on the top is the average in the x-axis. So basically the movement with the head going up and down was very important in classifying the behaviors. Then it was the y-average, so the movement side to side was very important. And it goes on with various combinations as you go down here. But then on the right here is called the confusion matrix, where basically what we did was, once we have the model, which was built on the training data set, we then tested it by predicting an independent data set called a testing data set. And it calculates an overall accuracy over here, which was at 94%. So basically the model was able to predict grazing, resting and walking with 94% accuracy. That's a little bit complicated, but I hope it makes sense in some way. So this is basically another graph to help you try and understand what these activity monitors are doing. And basically it's here you have the X, Y and Z axis, and on the left here you have basically the direction of movement. So here the animal's head is moving, this would be up, and here the animal's head is down. Here the animal's head is moving to the left, and here it's moving to the right. Here the animal's head is moving toward its body, and here it's moving away from its body. And then basically these lines have been colored by these three behavioral categories: grazing, resting and walking. So here you can see, for example, that the animal was resting over here. Its head was standing, or was erect, it was up. Here it puts its head down and it starts grazing. Here it begins resting again. It begins resting again, and here you can see that it says it's resting here, but it's in the downward direction. But this may be because the animal was lying down. So it's difficult for us to look at this one graph and categorize the behaviors, but the random forest model uses complex algorithms, and it's able to do it more accurately. Yeah, so that's just to give you an idea of how it works. But basically, yeah, that's all I have to show you. I hope it's helped you understand a little bit more what we've done. And I'd just like to thank Fritz Noel, the farmer, for offering us his land and his oxen to work with, and especially to Gerbrand now for all his help through this trial. He's been very valuable doing the work on the ground. And then yeah, thank you to Conservation South Africa for all their support, to the funders, although I don't have their pictures here. It's Cape Wool South Africa, Red Meat Research and Development Fund, for my personal funders, the Oppenheimer Memorial Trust and Green Matter and UCT. And thank you to Heidi Hawkins, my supervisor, for your input. And yeah, that's all the formalities. I just want you to know, yeah, if you can contact me if you have any questions, and I'd be happy to talk. Cheers.